Darkness swallowed the room whole. A sudden, suffocating silence filled the air, stretching between the flickering echoes of unseen movement. Relina didn't hesitate. She drew her sword in a single, fluid motion, angling the blade toward the void that now surrounded them. The candlelight had been extinguished, but she didn't need sight to know she wasn't alone. Something else was here. Something wrong. A slow, deliberate scrape echoed from the far side of the chamber, claws against stone. Then another, and another. The scent of old decay curled in the air, thick and cloying. A whisper slithered through the room, but it wasn't Veymar's voice. This one was older, rasping and stretched, like dried leather cracking apart.
"She stinks of life."
The voice came from everywhere. Above, behind, beneath, then the sound of breath, long and rattling, something inhaling deeply, savoring the moment.
"I have waited far too long for this."
Relina's pulse pounded in her ears, but she stood her ground. A hunter knew fear, but never let it rule them. A sharp, unnatural clicking noise echoed against the walls, growing louder, faster. The thing was moving, circling.
"Veymar, call off your pet,"
she growled, not lowering her blade. But there was no response. The bastard was watching, testing her, her fingers tightened around her sword hilt, her stance shifting slightly. A muffled noise, faint, strained. Then,
"Quimby, talk to me."
"Relina!"
Quimby's voice, hoarse, barely audible, but something was wrong. The ropes that bound him should have creaked as he struggled, but there was only silence. Then the thing in the darkness laughed. It was a dry, brittle sound, devoid of humor.
"He is mine now."
The blood in Relina's veins turned ice cold. The creature lunged. She barely had time to react. A rush of air, then the impact. Something massive, impossibly fast, slammed into her, sending her skidding back across the stone. Her boots scraped against the floor as she twisted, bringing her sword up just in time to meet a pair of gleaming, curved talons. The screech of metal on bone filled the chamber. The darkness shifted, and then light. Veymar had relit a single candle. Its flickering glow barely reached the center of the room, but it was enough. Relina saw it. Twisted, emaciated, and monstrous, it crouched before her, its elongated limbs impossibly thin, yet brimming with sinewy strength. Its skin was pale, taut, stretched over a skeletal frame, and its fingers ended in black, jagged claws. Hollow, milky white eyes bore into her, filled with hunger, filled with a cruelty that had long forgotten what it meant to be human. It was ancient, and it was starving.
"You reek of defiance. It will be exquisite to break you."
The Nosferatu rasped, its lipless mouth curling over jagged, uneven fangs. Relina didn't answer. Words meant nothing to this thing. It only understood one language. She attacked. Steel flashed. She struck fast, fluid, aiming for its throat. The Nosferatu twisted, its movement unnatural, its spine bending far too much as it slithered backward, avoiding her blade by a breath. A claw lashed out. Relina ducked, feeling the air whistle past her ear as she countered, driving her sword in a sharp cutting arc toward its exposed ribs. Too fast, the Nosferatu vanished into the dark. Relina steadied herself, forcing her breathing to slow. The thing wasn't just attacking, it was playing with her. Another whisper.
"I have tasted the blood of kings, priests, hunters."
The voice slithered through the void.
"You are no different."
A shift in the shadows, left. Relina pivoted just in time, another strike. This time she didn't dodge. She met its claws with her blade, twisting it downward in a brutal riposte. The Nosferatu recoiled with an unnatural hiss as blackened ichor dripped from its arm. For the first time, it laughed.
Yes, fight me. Make it worth it.
Relina didn't let up. She pressed forward, pushing the attack. Every step, every cut, every movement was deliberate. No wasted motion. The Nosferatu was fast, but Relina had trained her entire life for this. A brutal slash, deep across its collarbone, a hiss of pain. It staggered back, just a step, but she saw it. Doubt. Relina raised her sword, her voice unwavering.
I've slain worse than you, monster, and I'll do it again.
The Nosferatu grinned, revealing rows of uneven, yellowed fangs.
That would be a nice trick, Hunter.
Before she could react, the darkness rushed inward, swallowing the room whole. Another sound, Quimby's voice, muffled, distant. Then, cold fingers closed around her wrist. The Nosferatu was behind her. She twisted, striking blindly, but the world tilted, and everything went black. Relina's head pounded. Cold stone pressed against her back. A damp, stale air filled her lungs. She blinked. Her vision was hazy, blurred, but she could see them. Figures. 3. Veymar sat atop an ornate, high-backed chair, a throne carved from bone. The Nosferatu stood at his side, licking the ichor from its wounded arm, grinning through blood-stained fangs.
You put on quite a show, my dear Hunter.
Relina tried to move. Her muscles screamed in protest. Bound. She was bound. The Nosferatu chuckled.
Now, let's have some fun.
You should rest. That was quite the battle.
Relina ignored him. Her gaze darted past the Nosferatu, locking onto Quimby. He was slumped in the chair, arms still bound, but his chest rose and fell. Alive, a flicker of relief steadied her rage. Quimby lifted his head sluggishly, his voice hoarse.
You look like you've had better days, Relina.
And you look like you got caught stealing from the wrong noble's purse again.
She smirked despite herself. His eyes widened slightly at her words, then darted toward Veymar. The vampire chuckled.
Oh, is that what you think, my dear Hunter? A simple thief? A trickster caught in the wrong place at the wrong time?
He gestured toward Quimby as if he were an afterthought. His voice darkened, smooth as silk, yet brimming with malice.
Your little friend is far more interesting than that.
Relina clenched her fists.
Let him go.
The Nosferatu let out a dry, rattling laugh. Veymar merely sighed.
You are in no position to demand anything, but I do so enjoy your fire, Hunter. Perhaps a lesson is in order.
With a lazy motion, he waved a hand toward the Nosferatu. The creature's grin widened. Relina braced herself, muscles coiling. Then it moved, faster than thought. A blur of motion, and suddenly it was beside Quimby. Its long, clawed fingers trailed lazily across the halfling's shoulder, its face inches from his.
Small one. So much potential.
It rasped, inhaling deeply. Quimby didn't move, didn't breathe, but his wide eyes flicked toward Relina, something frantic behind them.
Touch him again, and I swear I'll carve out your black heart and feed it to the crows.
Relina snarled, voice razor sharp. The Nosferatu's grin stretched impossibly wide. Veymar, however, merely raised an eyebrow.
So protective, and yet you know so little of why he is here.
He mused. Relina's jaw clenched.
Then enlighten me.
Veymar sighed, almost as if he were bored.
You see, your little friend wandered into my domain, uninvited. That alone is reason enough to warrant hospitality.
Quimby scoffed, his voice still raw.
Didn't realize getting tied to a chair and threatened by a corpse was part of your guest accommodations.
The Nosferatu hissed, its claws tightening against his shoulder, but Veymar raised a single hand.
Patience.
Why was he here?
Veymar turned his gaze back to her, a glimmer of something knowing behind his dark eyes.
Now that is the real question.
A pause. Then a slow, deliberate smile crept across his face.
Why don't you ask him?
Relina turned back to Quimby. He had gone rigid, his mouth pressed into a thin line. Something was wrong. She knew Quimby, knew his bravado, his endless banter. But now he was silent. Not just from exhaustion, not from fear. He was hiding something. Relina's stomach tightened.
Quimby, why are you here?
His jaw tensed. For the first time since she'd seen him, he wouldn't meet her eyes. Veymar chuckled, standing from his throne.
Secrets between friends? How delicious.
He took a slow step forward.
You see, my dear hunter, I know exactly why your dear companion came to me. He offered himself.
Relina felt the words slam into her like a physical force. No, that wasn't possible. Quimby was reckless, sure. He was a trickster, a fool sometimes, but he wasn't stupid, wasn't suicidal. Was he? She forced her voice to stay steady.
That's a lie.
Is it?
Veymar smiled. Relina turned back to Quimby.
Tell me it's not true.
Quimby swallowed, his throat working. Then, at last, he spoke.
It's too difficult to explain, Relina.
Her blood went cold. Veymar laughed, slow and delighted.
Now, my dear, shall we unravel this mystery together?
He murmured, stepping closer, his gaze locked onto hers. The doors behind him creaked open. Beyond them, darkness stretched, deep, endless, waiting, and somewhere within it, answers. The hunt was far from over. The heavy wooden doors groaned as they swung inward, revealing the yawning abyss beyond. A cold draft slithered through the opening, carrying with it the scent of damp stone and something more elusive, something ancient. Relina's body tensed, her mind calculating every possible way this could turn against her. Quimby still wouldn't meet her eyes. That unsettled her more than Veymar's smirk or the Nosferatu's lingering presence. The vampire lord stepped aside with a theatrical sweep of his hand.
Shall we?
Relina didn't move.
Where does that lead?
Veymar sighed as if disappointed.
Still so mistrusting. This is an invitation, not a demand. You want answers, do you not?
Relina shifted her weight subtly, testing the bindings. The knots were expertly done, but she'd gotten out of worse. She could feel Quimby's eyes flicking toward her, reading her tension. He knew what she was thinking, yet he still wasn't saying a word. Veymar watched them both with amusement.
I do enjoy this little unspoken language you share with one another. But I assure you, Hunter, you will need more than clever glances to unravel this puzzle.
He stepped forward slowly, his presence suffocating. She forced her breath to steady.
You're wasting your time trying to play mind games with me.
Oh, but I haven't even begun.
Veymar purred. The Nosferatu let out a low, rattling chuckle, its elongated claws scraping along Quimby's chair as it circled behind him. Relina clenched her jaw.
Get your pet away from him.
Veymar raised a single brow.
Such concern for your companion, and yet you still do not ask him the most important question.
Which is...
Veymar leaned in just enough that his voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper.
Why did he seek me out?
Silence. Relina barely breathed as she turned back to Quimby.
Quimby, tell me right now why you're here.
His hands twitched against the bindings. His mouth opened, then closed again. Veymar chuckled.
Ah, there it is.
Something in Relina's chest twisted. Quimby had never hesitated to give an answer, no matter how absurd or snarky. But now he looked like a man standing at the edge of a chasm, debating whether to jump.
Quimby, say it!
His lips parted, and for a fleeting moment she thought he might. But then his gaze darted, just for an instant, toward Veymar. The vampire merely smiled. Quimby shut his mouth again. A cold realization settled over her. He was afraid. Of what? Of Veymar? That was obvious. But there was more, something deeper. The air in the chamber felt heavier, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Finally, Quimby exhaled.
I didn't have a choice.
That's not good enough.
Quimby swallowed, his throat working. He still wouldn't look at her. Veymar hummed approvingly.
So stubborn, your little friend.
He gestured toward the open doorway.
Shall we? I find that the best revelations occur in the depths, away from prying eyes.
Relina's mind raced. She could see no clear way out of this without getting them both killed. She needed leverage, an opportunity, anything. She let out a slow breath, forcing control into her voice.
Fine, but he stays with me.
Veymar's smile widened.
Oh, of course. I wouldn't dream of separating you.
Relina didn't trust a word of that. The Nosferatu reached for Quimby, its bony fingers trailing along the ropes. A flick of its wrist, and the bindings snapped free. Quimby slumped forward with a grunt, rubbing his wrists. He gave Relina a quick side glance, filled with something between relief and guilt. She'd deal with that later. For now, they had to move forward. Veymar gestured again toward the darkness beyond the doors.
Now, shall we?
Relina met Quimby's gaze.
Stay close.
He gave her the faintest nod. Together, they stepped into the abyss. Behind them, the doors creaked shut, and the darkness swallowed them whole.